I am Japanese Chinese American. I am a second generation Chinese and fifth generation Japanese. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I currently attend UC San Diego. Not being a first generation immigrant, a lot of Japanese and Chinese culture I learned came from my grandparents rather than my parents. Especially with being mixed, it was always hard to find a community I belonged in because I was either too Japanese, too American, too Chinese, or often not enough of either. For my family, learning English was prioritized over our cultural languages, so I ended up going to language schools to learn both Japanese and Chinese. I found that although there are people who are supportive of learning their parents' language, there's also this kind of gatekeeping aspect, as in if I can't speak the language proficiently, it showed how much of my cultural identity was lost and somehow I wasn't good enough to be accepted into either of these communities. After realizing that, I stopped going because I learned that I was actually going out of validation rather than connecting with my roots. Thankfully, I haven't experienced any instances of xenophobia in the US, but I have experienced a lot of microaggressions. I've heard things like, I thought your parents hated each other, because of their cultures are Japanese and Chinese and their histories, and you can't even speak Chinese or Japanese. No, who are you to determine my cultural identity? I actually experienced a time where I disassociated myself with Asian culture and tried to assimilate into US culture because eventually it all caught up with me. I realized I should be focusing on other things. For a lot of other people, they have that internal clash with them their whole lives. So I think location affects the connection that you have with your culture, but I also believe that it's up to the individual and how important maintaining that culture is to them. I know there's definitely people who do care about maintaining that in the sense that identity is linked to a person's story and is often a byproduct of their past, present, and future. I feel like there's so many diverse stories out there and they're just being completely erased, and that often comes with a lot of consequences on a micro and macro level.
Hello, my name is Martha Yam. I'm 14 years old. I am African American and a first-generation immigrant. I don't interact or share my culture with other people in my community very much. Whenever my friends do come over, they do like to try some of the traditional African foods my mom likes to cook, but they don't usually ever try them again because they think they're spicy or they're not a fan of it. I have not personally experienced any instances of xenophobia. However, I do know my parents have. They have a strong African accent because they immigrated here from Cameroon, Africa. I know that my dad has had a lot of problems in his workplace with his coworkers not treating him right because they don't think he's qualified enough just because he has an accent and he's an immigrant. He's had to switch job places a lot because he's had a lot of problems. I have had struggles avoiding assimilation into US culture. When I was younger, I wanted to blend in so much, so I completely assimilated. I didn't want to claim any of my African culture. I was just American, and that's what I try to be. But now as I'm growing older, I am seeing the value in my culture and the value in being different. And I'm trying to get more connected with it, ask my parents about how it is back in Africa, and learn the French language, which is the main language that they speak in my country. I do think location affects the connection you have to your culture. As a first-generation immigrant, I was born in America whilst the rest of my family was born in Cameroon. And I do think if I was born in Cameroon, I would have had more of a connection than I do now. And I'm not saying that location is the main factor to having a connection to your culture, but just me personally being surrounded by US culture all my life, I never really got a chance to connect. I think my teachers and peers can help me connect to my culture in an academic setting by not being as judgmental. There's such a stigma around Africa that it is only poor and they don't have water. I remember hearing my friends talk about Africa in such a demeaning way, and it was very much disheartening to hear. I also think that we should start teaching more diverse cultures like the Diversify Narrative Initiative states. Like the fact that African American Studies is a separate class that people mainly don't take is very sad. So I think that we should just all be immersed into so many different cultures so that we are not as judgmental.
Hi everyone, my name is Chika Ndwagebe and I'm 21 years old, African. My dad is Nigerian Igbo and my mom is Caucasian white. And I suppose I'm technically a second generation immigrant as my father immigrated to the US from Nigeria after marrying my mother who is an after-born US citizen. But I was actually born in Bintu, Namibia before my family returned to the States. While I'm not bilingual, my father is, and he regularly calls other extended family members in Nigeria and speaks Igbo with them. And so I picked up a few words here and there. My father has a fairly noticeable accent in speaking English, which has been mocked and or made fun of on certain occasions, but rarely to his face. He usually doesn't say anything in response and just lets it go because he doesn't feel like making it a big deal. But it is very disrespectful, and I know it bothers him, and it definitely bothers me. I haven't really experienced anything too aggressive in terms of xenophobia, just kind of microaggressions for the most part personally. Getting called the N-word at sporting events occasionally, pretty standard fare. The most common thing I've experienced is a general sense of exclusion due to my obviously non-white name. Even in my third year as a starting player, the announcer at games would butcher my name consistently. When taking attendance in class, I would just jump in and offer the pronunciation of my name, rather than wait for the teacher to get to my name, stop with a confused look on their face, and not know what to do. I know it's not really their fault in that situation, but to always be the odd one out in social situations just because of your name isn't the most fun way to go through life, obviously. But it's all good though. I've since come to embrace the unique nature of my name, and I definitely would trade it for any other name. I've definitely felt the pressure to acclimate to the general culture of the U.S., but I mean, rather than kind of do that and go along with that, I think I've been able to code switch with my multicultural experience. And I felt that I more often kind of just change depending on the environment I'm in. So my family traveled a good bit during my childhood. We lived in Nigeria, Namibia, Myanmar, Hong Kong, and the US for substantial periods of time. And the different cultures in these countries was very interesting to experience, and it's definitely given me a different perspective from the US-centric one that I've gained from my time living in the US. But I don't think I've lost those perspectives since acclimating to the US. I think I might not utilize them as much when I'm around people who can't relate, but I still hold on to them. I do think being physically immersed in a culture is very beneficial, as daily small interactions with others and even places can be impactful from a cultural perspective. I can give a few examples from a trip my family took to Nigeria, Namibia, and South Africa during the summer of 2010. So this was the only time I'd actually been back to the African continent since leaving when I was 2 years old. And upon entry to Namibia, I handed my passport to the customs agent, and she looked at it. And after noticing I was born in Bintu, in Namibia, she handed it back to me, and she said something that I'll never forget. She said, "Welcome home." And I know it sounds like a really small detail, but it really resonated with me. And it was a moment of kind of affirmation and acceptance of my heritage, and something that I didn't really get to think about a lot living in the US. And another moment was while visiting my extended family in Nigeria, in our home village of Mwati and Sulu. It was wild to meet with people my parents knew there and be welcomed because they remembered me from when I was a baby. And in contrast to the exclusion I usually feel in the US because of my name, it was basically the opposite when I was in the village. My name was like a normal name and no longer stuck out like a sore thumb. So my full name is Chika Cha, and that means God is the greatest in Igbo. And people could tell I belong to an Igbo family just from my name, which is dope. I think the biggest thing teachers and peers can do to help me connect with my culture is just to embrace the fact that the US is not the only country on earth. I know it sounds obvious, but living in the US is so different from basically everywhere else I've lived, in that Americans are literally raised to believe that the US is the center of the universe and a perfect country. But at the end of the day, it's really not some gold standard that every other nation should be seeking to emulate. A great example is the way current events in history are taught in high school. So multiple years of US history are required, including civics and government, while every other area of the world is kind of just grouped together and relegated to elective courses that really don't do them justice in any way. I think a more holistic curriculum that mandates the exploration of a plethora of world cultures would more readily prepare U.S. students to interact with people from other areas of the world and in a more respectful and appreciative way. Normally, I don't have the opportunity to share my culture with the other people in my community like this, so it's definitely a great way to give myself and other Black people space to express our heritage.